So we are going to be talking about data annotations today, and we've used them in the past to basically ensure that some of the data in our models is required. We've also used the range to make sure that the data is entered within certain limits to make sure it's accurate. And what we're going to be learning today are all sorts of additional data annotations that you can add to not only validate your data, but to ensure that it's accurate. And if you would like to alter your database schema, you will be learning some annotations that do that as well. Not only are we going to be learning annotations that affect models, but we're going to be taking a look at some that are used in the controller. And a couple key points that you need to keep in mind is that if you used the validation annotations, you need this using statement in the model, or if you happen to have them in your controller, you'd need it there as well, but it's more model-based, and it's just using system component model data annotations. Now, if you have annotations that are going to alter the schema, which is a column name or the name of your table, something like that, or maybe you're creating an index, then you need a little different using statement, which is using system component model data annotations .schema. So it's basically the same one as before with .schema on the end. We are going to be looking at data annotations for controllers and models. And first, we are going to look at the ones that are typically used in controllers. And there's basically three types of, they're called action selector annotation attributes. So action selectors. There are action name, non-action, and action verbs. So action name we have seen in the past. This allows a developer to override the action method name and use a different action method name instead. So this little example has an index action method. And then you'll notice that it also has an action method called getCurrentTime with the action selector above it that is basically changing the action name to current time. In our second example, we have an artist controller with a delete confirmed action method. So basically, after you delete an item, it returns to the controller and it goes into this action method. And so what we've done here is on post, we are allowing them to just have an action name of delete instead of delete confirmed. Okay, so what that means is basically in either case, they can use the new action name instead of the old one. So non-action. Non-action attribute indicates that the action method of a controller is not actually an action method. So it cannot be directly accessed by entering the controller and action method up in the URL. It has to be called by a different method. So expanding on that previous example where we had the action name of current time, you can see that we are calling time string. So this is an internal call. It's going to a non-action method. So the only way that time string can be executed is by an internal call like this. Okay, so it'll go down here, it'll execute this, and that is the only way this is going to be executed. You cannot key in the URL because we have said that this is a non-action method. Action verbs we have also already used. HTTP GET and HTTP POST are both action verbs. So GET is the default for all of the action methods. And if you have two action methods that have the same name, then one of them needs to have the HTTP POST verb. Otherwise, you are going to get errors. So how this is typically set up is you have get and post. Get will display an empty form, and then when they submit it, it goes through post. Okay, and so this is just a little example. Here we've got get, and this is an edit method. So basically we're retrieving, in this case, student information based on a student ID, and we're passing that along to the view. So conceivably, they're going to make changes, they're going to submit, and then it's going to come through post. And so it's post job to update the database. And then typically, you will redirect to an index where you display all the data. MVC does support other action verbs besides get and post. Okay, but get and post are the ones that are used most often. So I did include the list here. In our class, we pretty much use get and post. But you can see we've got one called HTTP put, HTTP delete, HTTP options, and HTTP patch. So additional ones that you can use. However, we are pretty much using get and post. So we have also used model binding already. And this is done two different ways. The first way is you can actually bind to primitive values. So in our GET requests, quite often, we have option of a parameter. So when they key in the URL, we would do the controller slash action method name slash, and then if we wanted a parameter, we would key it in. And that gets pulled in as the ID. Okay, so here's a little example of how that might look on the URL. And because that data, in this case the 1, is mapped to ID, it is considered binding to a primitive. And it works for multiple parameters in addition to single parameters. As you know, the single parameter ID is specified in the startup file. So if I open this up and we take a look at startup, this is where ID is specified as part of the default route. Not only do you bind to primitive values, you can bind to more complex data types like models. So how we would do that, in this example, we have a student class, and then this is an action method that is in our controller. Happens to be an edit. And you can see that in the parameter list, we are defining a student object. Okay? And then we are taking the different properties that are in that student object, and we are putting them in various variables. We end up, because this is an edit and a post, we do end up updating the database here and then doing a little redirect. But the key thing here is that we are bringing in the model object. That is what does the binding. And this little graphic just shows you that when you submit a form with the action of method and action of post, it'll come through HTTP post, and all of the items in your form can be accessed through the object and assigned to variables. Now, quite often what you see in a controller is the bind attribute, because instead of pulling in everything from the form, it pulls in only the properties that it wants to use. And it does that by using include. So we use bind, and in parentheses, you say include equals, and these are the properties that you are going to use. And then you still have to create your object. Now, not only can you include specific properties, but you can also exclude a property. So if you wanted to pull in everything except for like one or two, then you can use exclude. So a little more on model binding. It's actually a two-step process. The values are collected from the incoming HTTP request, and then either the primitive type, which would just be a parameter, or the complex type, which is a model, are populated with values. So this little graphic kind of shows how that works. We have worked with model state already. So as a little review, when you are filling out a form, if there are errors, then model state is valid is going to return false. And how that is incorporated into an action method is that before you update the database, you check to see if the model state is valid. If it's true, then you, in this case, because this is a create, we are adding the row to our table and we are saving the change. Okay? If it's false, then what we do is we return to the form and we're passing along the object. So the form is going to display the data that's there along with the error messages. So here's just another example, and it is incorporating try and catch, which you all should be familiar with. It's in all languages, and I know you've used it before. So this is also a post. It is an edit. You can see that we are only really concerned with the artist ID and the name. That's all we're pulling in. We're creating an object. And so we are saying if for some reason the ID that we wanted to see, if that ID does not equal the artist ID, we got a pretty big problem. So we are returning not found. If the model state is valid, okay, which means that we've updated our form, right? It showed us the data, we made a change, we posted, okay? Then go ahead and update the table and save the changes. If there is a problem updating, okay, then we go down to the catch. And if the only reason there would really be a problem updating is if somebody else was updating that record already. Okay, so that's why it's a concurrency exception. So it comes down here. And so it's basically saying that if for some reason, the row in the table no longer exists, it's going to return not found. Okay, so that scenario would involve two people access the exact same row. One person is in the process of updating but hasn't submitted. The other person deletes, okay, and they submit. It gets deleted before the person can submit the update. Highly unlikely, but that's what this scenario is preventing or checking for. So basically, it's saying if the row doesn't exist, then we're going to say that it's not found. Otherwise, we throw the error. So what that would be two people maybe updating the record at the same time. So if we were actually able to successfully update the record, then it redirects us to the index. Otherwise, that means the model state is not valid. So we return to the original form displaying the data and the errors. Okay, so that is what is happening in this particular edit action method.